Okay, it's gone quiet. So welcome everyone to LSE Online Courses Networking event. My name is Emma Voigt. I'm the head of the LSE Online team, a team which I'm very, very proud to lead and that has put on this event, which is set to be a fantastic event, which we hope you enjoy. So before we jump in, first of all, a massive thank you to Sanjana and Holly, who are all at the back, keeping very quiet, but well done everyone for putting on this event, and thank you very much. Our portfolio as the online team has grown significantly in the last few years with the launch of our online masterclasses, our career accelerator, 9 full undergraduate degrees, and we now have 30 online certificate courses. Most of you here tonight are all studying an online certificate course, so when we come on to the second part of this event, please do talk to each other, find out which courses you're studying, share your recommendations, share your experiences. We have also launched the LSE Online Twitter and LinkedIn, so if you do post about the event tonight, please use our hashtag, which is up here, hashtag LSE Online Networking. We're very keen to see and share your posts and hear your feedback about the event today. So to briefly run you through the order of events, we have 2 parts tonight. The first is a lecture and Q&A session from Dr. Grace Lordan. Grace is the founding director of the Inclusion Initiative and an associate professor in LSE's Department for Psychological and Behavioural Science. Dr. Lordan is also course convener for our Inclusive Leadership through Behavioural Science short course, and she will be revealing the newest leadership hacks that will save you time, make your team more productive and improve psychological safety. By drawing on her knowledge of academic evidence and over a decade of consultancy, Grace will make sure that you come away with a fresh perspective of leadership. At 7 p.m, we will make our way over to the new Marshall building for the networking reception, where you can meet participants from your own courses and from other courses. There will be 100 copies of Grace's book, Think Big, available if you make your way over there on a first-come, first-served basis. So a bit of housekeeping. We are not expecting the fire alarm to go off, but if it does, please calmly make your way up to either exit at the back. We are recording the presentation, so please do make sure your phone is either switched off or on silent. We have a photographer here. If you don't wish to feature in any of the photos, again, please do make yourself known discreetly to one of the LSE Online members of staff, and that's absolutely fine. We won't take any photos of you. There will be roaming mics for the Q&A session, but as you will see, there are also mics in front of you. They're operated with a button, so if you do want to ask a question, just make sure you're holding that down when you speak so that we can hear you at the front. I think that is everything from me. So without further ado, I will pass over to Dr. Grace Lordan.
Hi everybody, it's absolutely wonderful to be here. I always dread when somebody introduces me because they raise expectations to a level that I'm never quite sure that I can meet, but I will give it a good go. Tonight I have a very unusual title, Leadership, Tell Me Something That I Don't Know, because I'm very much hoping that 1 or 2 things that I will tell you in the lecture are things that you don't know. I realise it's kind of a lofty promise to make to LSE Online students, because you do look like people who engage in a lot of work in continuous education, but give me a chance. You'll notice up in the corner there's 2 logos. The first is for LSE Inclusion Initiative, where I am the director. I have colleagues here, Yolanda and Nikita. We work basically thinking about how inclusion can be used to make teams more productive. And we do have a course, an online course, if you want to check it out after the lecture, Inclusive Leadership through Behavioural Science. Lucky for you, you'll get a copy of my book, Think Big, which is where I spend my other 50% of my time talking about. And that's about how you can be successful using behavioural science life hacks. What I will say is that if you like the lecture, you should run towards the reception to get your free copy. If you don't like the lecture, you should also go and gift it to somebody in the holiday season who you don't like. So either way, it's a win-win from this evening. So I'm going to start with a participative exercise, and I want you to imagine that you enter a meeting, and on the meeting are two things for discussion. So the first is a nuclear power plant, which will cost $25 million US, and the second is a bike shed that will be attached to the nuclear power plant that will cost $1,000 US. And I want you to picture the various colleagues and team members who you've met over your life course up to now, and I want you to imagine how long you will spend discussing the nuclear power plant and the costs, benefits and risks in details that will allow you make a decision about that nuclear power plant in that hour versus the bike shed. And I want you to hold that in your memory. It's something that I often do when we're in executive class and we have people shout, so there's no need to shout it out. But mostly, everyone will agree that you won't spend the majority of time discussing you won't spend the majority of time discussing the nuclear power plant. You'll spend the majority of time discussing the bike shed. And this inspired the bike shed effect that was developed in 1957 and has been shown to be repeated in meetings where very, very complex things need to be discovered, from decisions about pensions, from which project to pursue, basically from anything where the costs, benefits and risk are very hard to visualize over long run horizons. Now you might have some guesses about why that might be. So why is it that if we enter meetings and there's something very, very complicated on the agenda, that we spend very, very little time talking about the cost, benefits and the risk? And some people will say, actually, maybe there's an expert in the room and we should trust the expert. Yes, you should trust experts, but experts should be able to explain things to you in a language that you understand, so you understand the cost, benefit and risk. And as someone in the meeting, if you're a decision maker, that you'll ultimately be able to make a sensible decision. And in my work, I've noticed this over and over again, from financial services to technology to manufacturing, public services, even here at the LSE, people tend to spend too much time deliberating the small stuff, should we have a bike shed, and not enough time deliberating the big stuff. And it isn't because people trust experts, because actually often after the fact, people will say, well, I didn't really think that we were going in the right direction when mistakes are made. And that's something else that we look at in behavioural science, cognitive dissonance. But a lot of this is down to ego, which I find fascinating. So most human beings don't like to be in a room where they don't fully understand the content that's being explored. We do much better when we're in a room with people who are like us, having conversations about topics that we're actually familiar with. And we find it really hard to say, I don't know, and to probe people on cost, benefits and risk on these really, really big decisions. And some of my work is to change people's minds on that, because you can imagine now in this economy, we've had so much uncertainty looking backwards, we're going to have so much uncertainty going forwards, that ego is probably something that doesn't belong in the room, and the bike shed effect is definitely not something that belongs in the room. Another experiment that I like to do when I teach executive classes is to have pieces of paper in front of people and to ask one side of the room to write down when was the last time they changed their mind about a fundamental belief they had at work that caused them to work in a way that was positively better. And on the other side of the room, I'll ask people, can you write down a few examples of beliefs you think one or more of your colleagues should change that would make your work life better? And what's really interesting is this side of the room have loads of answers to give me about how their colleagues should fundamentally change. And on the other side of the room, I get very, very few answers. And if you talk to executives, most executives will say to you today, vulnerability is really important. It's really important that our team members will challenge the status quo. So when there's something happening and they have hidden information, that they tell us about that hidden information. And then you ask them, you say, when was the last time that a team member who was more junior to you in the organization challenged you about something that you were really adamant should go ahead and you changed your mind? And it's really, really difficult to get a good answer for that. So again, my work is really about these topics. How do you move ego out of team meetings? How do you get people to move away from status quo bias? And again, given the inclusion initiative, how do we get people to really embrace folk around the table who think very differently to them, who might be disagreeing with them a lot of the time, but who have information that's valuable to them? And to kind of get there, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of introduction to behavioural science. So our course is new, so I'm guessing most of you haven't done it. If you're interested in this, we have loads of free resources online, so do check it out. But a lot of what we do is based on the fact that human beings have two different thinking styles. One, very, very fast, where you're on autopilot. And the second is very, very slow and very, very deliberate. Most people think they spend the majority of time in their slow brain, but there's actually really good evidence to suggest that we spend the majority of time in our fast brain, making decisions on autopilot that are habit-driven. Now, any of you who've worked in a corporate company or in public service in a big organization will have heard of unconscious bias training. And the job of unconscious bias training is for somebody to meet you for 3 or 4 hours and to give you some information in that 3 or 4 hour session, do some exercises that will cause your fast brain to be unbiased. And honestly, that makes absolutely no sense. If I am working in the back of my brain 80% of the time, which is what the evidence shows, the idea that somebody can come in and reprogram that in 3 or 4 hours isn't very intuitive, and it's also backed up by the evidence. It might surprise you to know that after World War II, there was a meta-analysis written on unconscious bias training that demonstrated a 0 or a negative effect for unconscious bias training in organizations, and things haven't gone better. So we like investing in unconscious bias training, but it doesn't work. But for our purposes this evening, we're interested in the fast brain. So if you're interested in leadership, I think one thing to recognize, and especially if you're a leader of leaders, that a lot of people who you're working with are in habit mode about 80% of their waking hours. And the best thing that you can then do is think about, how can I embed habits that allow my team be more successful? Or flip it another way, how can you embed habits that allow yourself as an individual be more successful? And the reason that I care about this is, if you care about people in the organization, and if you're somebody who thinks that you want people to stay in the organization, you want people to thrive in the organization, and ultimately you want them to speak up and actually give you their perspective to the extent that it's actually good for the business, you want to pay attention to this. If you look at why people choose to stay or leave an organization, it's fundamentally down to their managers' habits. So we look now, for example, at the great resistance that's being talked about a lot in industry at the moment, which is the push for remote working. Some people want it, some people want to be back in the office. People are choosing to be with managers who have a habit of being in the office versus not, depending on their preferences. It's exactly the same if you talk about how meetings are run, how work is delegated. People form preferences around the habits and the style of a manager, and they will choose to work with that manager or choose to leave if the manager's habits don't allow them grow as individuals. And I'm going to start today by telling you a tale of poor System 1 leadership, and I'm going to end with giving you the hacks that I think are actually really helpful for future leaders in today's economy. So I already introduced you to ego. So the worst of leaders have high ego. So these are leaders who are high ego, who don't like being challenged, and who ultimately want to make all the decisions. So if you can think in your mind somebody who's a really command and control type leader, they typically have high ego. They're the people who come in and say, I want to go in this direction, and I need you all to bring me there. Very effective if we're in a growth cycle in the economy, actually, to have a leader who is a command and control style leader. Very effective in the 80s and 90s, not so effective during a fourth industrial revolution when the economy is going into contraction. The problem for the leader who has high ego is that they don't want to be challenged. They don't want their status quo to be challenged. And very often, they'll go to great lengths to not hire people who will challenge them. And they tend to hire what we call affinity bias. So if you've ever been in an organization where you've noticed people who hire their friends, who hire people like them, this will be somebody who is high ego. Because it's only somebody who is low ego who recognizes actually being challenged in my team environment is good for me, It widens my perspective and ultimately makes me more innovative. If you hire with affinity bias, there's a really positive side effect for you. You also get confirmation bias. So that basically means that any idea that you have, that you throw out into the room, you'll get people telling you that your idea is actually right. Again, not good for innovation, but it is good for your ego. So again, if you think about the tensions in organizations at the moment, we say we want to have diversity. Now, if you go and meet people who are underrepresented in organizations, and you ask them about one of their biggest challenges when they join organizations, they'll say it's the pressure to conform. There's a culture within the organization, it's a pressure to conform. And this isn't just about, okay, people want to go to the pub and have drinks and I don't like it. This is a pressure to conform in the meeting rooms, when people are having discussions, when they're trying to innovate, when they're trying to create. And it ultimately means that that wonderful person who represents an underrepresented point of view isn't getting heard. And that person has a few choices. They can choose if they want to have arguments within the room and push their perspective across. They can choose to disengage. They can choose to play the game and conform, or they can choose to leave. But in all those scenarios, it's not particularly good for business. And the last slide in my tale of poor System 1 leadership is that high ego leaders who hire people who are like them and who engage in confirmation bias, too few often recognize that they have biases, and they don't recognize System 1. And what I find really interesting about behavioral science is that if you go into cases in history, there's these major events that really affected large parts of the world that have been linked to System 1 bias. So if you're from the UK, this is Fred Goodwin. He ran RBS into a very, very big part in the global financial crisis, into financial distress. And if you look back at case studies that talk about Fred Goodwin, overconfidence and high ego is repeated over and over and over again in those case studies. The Challenger study, again, confirmation bias. If you're from the UK and you were somebody who was really shocked at people going to parties during COVID, you might think about why were they going to parties during COVID. Diffusion of responsibility is mentioned over and over again. BP oil spill, confirmation bias and diffusion of responsibility. So if we look at these big moments in history and we think about what was going on in people's minds when they were making decisions that affected the environment, that affected our global financial state, that affected people's morale during the worst pandemic of my lifetime, it doesn't come down to people making conscious, deliberate decisions that were terrible. It comes down to this System 1. So you really want to make sure that we have good habits in our System 1, both to keep people working with us, to get them giving us their good ideas when they're around the table, and also to reduce behavioral risk. And then you think about, right, this feels intuitive. It feels intuitive that habits matter as I go about my day when I'm managing. What are the barriers then for managers changing their System 1 habits? And I've spoken to you about ego, so I won't dwell on it anymore. For most managers, there's two other things that stand in the way. Firstly, changing your habits as a manager is actually quite hard. So anytime we try to change something that we've been doing for an incredibly long time, even if we know that it's good for us, it fundamentally is quite difficult. It's quite difficult to get to a level of consistency where you see change, and in the beginning, you actually have these negative impacts. The second is time. So when I teach inclusive leadership, I'll ask people, what's the barrier to you being an inclusive leader? I'm looking at your surveys. It doesn't look like your culture is particularly good here. People are saying they're not included. What's the barrier? And people would say time. We're burnt out. We're exhausted. To be inclusive, it's going to take much more time. And that is a fallacy, which isn't part of today's lecture, so I'll leave it there. But nonetheless, you do need to think about this kind of time constraint that people think that they have. So when I'm talking to you tonight about these kind of hacks that I think are worth taking on board for managers, I'm going to talk to you about things that are mainly time-saving. There's one that isn't, it's neutral, but that are mainly time-saving. And when I talk to managers, what I find really interesting is, if you're high ego, if you're somebody who really struggles to embed habits because getting to the level of consistency is hard, if you're somebody who feels, actually, I can't change because I'm just very, very time poor, I think the clock is ticking. So I think if we look at the future of work, If we look at the type of skills that are being priced higher in the labour market, I have some work with my colleague Cecily Justin that will come out quite soon that really shows that collaborative leadership, ability to bring people into the conversation so you get their hidden perspectives, is now getting higher wages in what we call the megastar firms. So these are the big firms that dominate every sector. A real signal that managers who have these skills are actually thriving. I think more than that, you might think about what's going to happen in the future as machines actually advance, where they're not going to be able to get people collaborating together. They're not going to be able to get people innovating. They're not going to be able to get people creating together. And ultimately, one of the skills that isn't being hollowed away by the Fourth Industrial Revolution is good leadership skills. And it isn't the leadership skills where somebody is command and control, where they engage in confirmation bias. Just like companies who run themselves that way, we'll see creative destruction, I think. And we're seeing a little bit of that already if you look at the people who are actually losing during the kind of hollowing out in the current recession versus those that are actually managing to stay on top. So for me, when I think about the future of leadership, I do think about people who are low ego, who are moving away from confirmation bias, and who ultimately are leading inclusively. And these are the 5 leadership hacks that I will give to you before we take Q&A, and hopefully a few of them will surprise you. So the first is, when I teach inclusive leadership training, very often companies that move towards being more inclusive start getting people involved in lots of decisions. So that basically means if you're somebody who's underrepresented in the organization, you'll find yourself on lots of committees. You'll find yourself in lots of discussions. Very often, you'll find yourself in the discussions to do with the bike shed rather than the nuclear power plant. So for me, if you think about being a leader, when do you need to have people who are different to you telling you your cost, benefit, and risk calculations are wrong? These are for the big decisions that you're going to make. These are for the single door decisions that you can't go backwards on. These are for the things that ultimately will hurt your people if you get them wrong. And for me, I think the first thing people should do, whether you're an individual trying to succeed in your own career, or whether you're somebody who's actually leading people and have a big vision about where they should go, is you should identify and prioritize the 5% of things that actually matter. And I've picked 5% because I've done this with lots of people who are in a variety of different sectors, and very often when you get to the nitty-gritty, very few of us actually make decisions on a daily basis that are really, really big and fundamentally will shake the core of our career or other people's. And when we do, those are the moments that we want to really get pinned to the wall and ask questions and scrutinized on the direction of travel. For the rest of the reversible door decisions, these are the moments where you say, this is my small stake stuff. This is where I can sink costs. If things go wrong, it doesn't really matter. Now, there's lots of, if you go to technology companies, there's this kind of motto, move fast and break things. And if you go outside technology, people find this really hard. So if you're in manufacturing services, financial services, they'll say, well, yeah, we want to fail fast. We like that logo, but we don't actually want to fail. And I think the reason is because we have the idea of what we should fail on wrong. Yes, there's 5% of the things that we have to be getting right. These are the big things. If we fail, we'll have financial distress. We'll have hired the wrong colleague. We'll have chosen the wrong project to green light that we can't reverse. For the 95% of things, we can do that. We can actually go backwards. So again, this reframing is actually really empowering. Fail at the 95% of things. Learn fast and iterate. Take an experimental approach. The second is really examine the 95% of things. Everyone feels so busy. I feel incredibly busy all the time, and I talk to people about these things, and I have to go back and look at what am I actually spending my time on in the week. And for the 95% that's left, think about, actually, do I need to spend as much time on these things? Are there things that I can actually get rid of altogether? Are there things that I can delegate to other people with autonomy, that I'm not looking over their shoulder, trusting people? And I've looked into this literature, and what I find really interesting is that perfectionism probably, and I use the word probably because I haven't quantified it fully yet, so next year, if I give a lecture standing right here, I will be able to say certainly in one direction or the other. But perfectionism probably costs companies as much as sick leave, tardiness, and all those things that we performance manage. Very few leaders performance manage perfectionism. Most of us will have sat in presentations where the presentation looked amazing. Somebody spent hours and hours and hours working on that PowerPoint, and ultimately we never saw it again. Maybe 10 minutes of a few bullets on a slide could have done for that particular meeting. I've done some work recently both in investment banking and private equity, and what's really interesting is for the younger generations coming up, we always hear about how grueling it is. You know, it's like a hazing. You have like 5, 6 years, you're entirely exhausted, you don't get to go to bed. And then you ask them, what are you doing? What are you doing on a daily basis? Modeling, PowerPoints, things that are never even looked at when the decisions are actually made. And again, you think, why are they spending their time on this? These are talented people. They could be doing something that fundamentally really matters for the business. So maybe there's some value in the grit. I don't think so. And I think there's a lot of moments where good is really good enough. So as individuals, and I think for our team, there are these moments where you say, you're spending too much time on this. You need to spend less. And actually, you spending too much time on this is a bad thing, because you could have been spending some time on this other thing. Or you could go home early. That's okay too. For the tasks that are left within the 95%, think with autonomy and transparency. So I've already mentioned delegation. And if, again, you ask people how they're actually spending their time in organizations, they're often with younger colleagues, in meetings with them, being CC'd on emails, and not necessarily adding any value to that particular process. And you ask them why, and they'll say, well, we want our younger colleagues to feel supported. Younger colleagues feel supported when, one, they know they can come to you with questions and any problems and that you're open to that. And two, if they make a mistake or if they fail, they know that you're not going to scream at them and treat them incredibly badly. And those two things, the support when they need input, that they can shadow you and watch you do something that they're really interested in, is absolutely necessary for nurturing colleagues who are younger than you in their career in organizations. Watching over their shoulder every single second, being on CC'd on every single email is definitely not necessary. So again, think about what autonomy means to you. And I labor this point because as human beings, we love to be in control ourselves. So everyone in this room, I will ask you, say, yes, I want more autonomy. But our managers, if we look back, in general, we would say my manager micromanaged me a bit more than I like. So again, giving that trust, and the pivotal point is that that person who's working with you knows if they make a mistake or if they need help, that you'll have their back and that you look out for them. The fourth, so first three are time saving, the fourth isn't time saving. So the fourth is really pay attention to equalizing opportunities, visibility, and voice. And I've started using this as a mantra because when I started working here at the LSE, because I do behavioural science and there's very few women in behavioural science as compared to men, I used to be asked to come to organizations and answer, how can we keep women talent in organizations? The women are leaving in kind of mid-career. And now, having looked at it for such a long time, I say it's exactly the same as men. Women want equal opportunities, visibility, and voice. People stay in jobs where they have opportunities to grow, they're seen, they have voices in meetings, and they leave those that they don't. And the real interesting thing for me about voice in meetings is that if you're in a meeting, if you've ever been in a meeting, and I think most of you will have this experience, and there's one or two people who are dominating the room, and I asked you, for the people who weren't speaking, who felt a bit disengaged, how do you feel their psychological safety was? Well, you would say, I think that their psychological safety was low. They said nothing in that meeting. But I think what's interesting is that the people who were dominating the room, the one or two people who were speaking too much in that situation, not letting others get their edge in, they probably have lower psychological safety compared to the individuals who are in meetings where there's equal opportunities, visibility, and voice. So what you're really witnessing is these kind of learned childhood behaviors where somebody's externalizing to get attention because they feel quite insecure in an individualistic culture, and then people who are retreating into themselves because they don't necessarily feel that they can speak in that moment. And I don't want you to think that everybody should be speaking in every meeting anyway. I think that's something maybe in UK culture that we've gotten wrong. You know, people need to participate, we need to make sure everyone speaks. People should feel comfortable to speak when they have something to say. And it's up to the person who's leading that discussion to quieten the people who are talking too much and bring the people who are saying too little into the conversation. But it's still fine for people not to have anything to say in particular meetings. So again, if I think about psychological safety, the one thing that I always ask people to start with is look at your meetings, and is there something about the dynamic that you can change with the way that you run the meeting that will ultimately make people speak a bit more and also actively listen to each other a bit less. And sometimes I've been asked to work with people who are highly talented, high income generators, but their team feel the culture in the meeting isn't correct. And usually, 9 out of 10 of those examples that I've got to audit, the thing I'll ask the person to change is them talking too much. So they need to actively listen, say a bit less, and allow colleagues to come to the meeting. And the last, which I've started kind of adding to this because of a colleague, Teresa Almeida, who isn't here tonight, who has summarized evidence on this in a really neat way. So if you're interested, do reach out to us or log on to our website. If you're thinking about leadership hacks that work to improve productivity, to make people stay in the organization, to make people to be much more likely to be happy and kind of report well on surveys, laughter is something to pay attention to. Count laughter. Are people laughing? Are they relaxed? Are their shoulders tense? Or are their arms crossed? I think it's really interesting if you look at the patterns of laughter and smiles from when we're children through to when we're in teenage years, through to when we hit the labor force, something really interesting happens. Basically, the amount we laugh and relax goes off a cliff when we get our first job, which is really depressing. And then, as we exit, it starts to recover. So I guess we start to enjoy retirement. And it finally recovers beyond beyond where we were when we were younger, around the age of 80. But most of us don't live to be 80 right now, so that's quite depressing. So as leaders, given that you've chosen to show up tonight, I really would encourage you to pay attention to laughter. We have a really good crib sheet to get people kind of working together in ways that build social cohesion that we will be happy to share. Again, don't trust us, it works. This is my one mantra for any suggestion that I give to you all this evening. Evaluate it for yourself. And this is a really easy one. If you try some of the interventions that we recommend, ultimately what you do is you count the laughters in the room. So really all I'm trying to say to you is figure out what your priorities are, this kind of 95%. Figure out how you can actually reduce that 95% by reducing perfectionism and throwing away some things that you've been doing for too long. Give more autonomy to your co-workers. Make people laugh more and equalize opportunities, visibility, and voice. And the reason that I've given you those is these are the best leadership tips that I know for enhancing productivity, which is what I care about. But they're also the best leadership tips that I know for improving psychological safety. And all psychological safety is a fancy way to say that if I show up to work for you, that I ultimately feel really comfortable giving to you information that I have that's different to the information that you know. And I feel comfortable challenging you on cost, benefits, and risk on the type of decisions that you're making, because I know that you're open to changing your mind. That's everything. We have some time for questions, and thank you for paying attention. And Yolanda, I can't see the clock, so can you let me know when we're out of time? So I don't people. Yes, please. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm the first one.
You're the very first.
Thank you.
And thank you for breaking the ice.
Oh, wow. And just stating at the front that I imagine there's just two of us, and I just
yes.
don't feel in the pressure of all those people behind me. Sorry for my English. First of all, thank you very much about all the things you mentioned about the behavior psychology, which actually the only things that inspire me at my MBA course. There is a full room of leaders, I believe. I don't know about the different courses, but at the MBA, it's actually about the leaders and about the leadership at all. Well, your advice, how to deliver all those valuable things that you describe and that we learned throughout our course, actually to the leaders with the high ego, because the leaders with a high ego actually thinking that we are the smartest person in a room. So now we have the full room of the smartest person. So who are actually the smart one? Well, how to be the leader for the leaders?
It's a great question, and I think if you're in a room where you feel like you're the smartest person, you're in the wrong room. I think that's the first thing to say. So most of us are attracted to be in rooms where we know everything what's going on, we're really in touch with the information, and I think that's okay if your role in that particular moment is to be an expert. I think as leaders or as people young in your career, whatever stage you're at, going into rooms where you really, really are struggling to follow the conversation, you really, really feel below average, is the best thing that you can do to yourself. So do it online if you really feel that you might struggle. Ideally, you do it on a regular basis, talking to people who know different and more things to you. And the reason that I say that, one, it's the way to challenge your ego. So if you're somebody who kind of says, actually, I want to make sure that I am open to being challenged, that's the best way to do it, to ultimately put yourself and immerse yourself in places where you know that you are the person who is at the lowest bar in the room. The second reason is because the best evidence come out of social sciences has to be on mean reversion. I've never seen in any country, in any context, where there's been a flip of the result, that where you go, you rise to the mean or you fall to the mean. So depending on where you are, you're either going up or you're either going down. And I think the third then is leaders of the future who ultimately want to do something really awesome, who kind of want to break the frontier, they need to be joining dots across ideas that haven't necessarily been seen yet. So joining dots across fields, joining dots across industries, joining dots across sectors. And one of my biggest frustrations with academia is that people work in silos. You know, I think if I go to the economics department, they're all economics talking to each other. I go to sociology, it's exactly the same thing. But the value for people who go into those rooms is really exponential. And if you study people who are extraordinarily successful in life, very often when they look back at their ideas, it isn't that they were, you know, an apple fell on their head, like kind of the myth goes, but rather they saw patterns happening in other sectors and other disciplines that other people didn't just see. So I think for the one thing that I would love to kind of leave with the room, and you know, you have access to all LSE public lectures in so many different disciplines, and not just from academics, but from practitioners, to put yourself in situations where you do feel, actually, I'm really struggling to follow this. Because you will learn, your ego will be lowered, and you'll see ideas. And the only tip that I ever have for anyone about career guidance, if I think about the one thing that really helped me, it was being a 4-year-old my entire life. So if I'm with you and you're in an entire discipline and we're in conversation, I will ask you, can you explain that in language that I understand? I really want to get it. Can you do it again? Can you do it again? And from that, I've learned about sectors that I know people don't usually jump across. So again, given that I am talking to a room of leaders, those moments where you say, I don't know, this language is too complicated for me, are the best moments, not just for you, but for other people in the room. Because I can tell you, if you're not understanding, other people aren't understanding either. It's a really great question.
Thank you. Can I
specify,
just not being involved in a conversation, just specify my question. If we're talking about influence in other leaders in my organization as a leader, for example, as a CEO, like I have the amount of power limited by the shareholders of the company.
Yeah.
But the upward influence, this is the question, maybe some hints how I can deliver those messages. But that I personally believe that the self-foolish, this is one of the biggest disease of the high ego leaders. And of course I can't approach my shareholders and say like, listen, you are like stupid and like high ego leaders because I attend the LSE election. They say this is the high ego leaders, this is about you. So obviously there should be some shortcuts how to approach inside the organization.
I can give you the narrative straight, right? Because that's one of the joys of me being able to kind of talk about the evidence, and you feel like a bunch of people who are open. I think in this case, you just use narrative, right? So you don't say the problem is that you're high ego. I think you basically say, look, in teams where you want to innovate and create, there's a few things that we know that work. One is equalizing voices in the room to make sure that people get a chance to speak. The second is really actively listening as a leader, so you're saying less. So, you know, some of the people that I've said, you know, you should probably say less in meetings, I didn't say you're high ego, you should say less. I just said, look, actively listening and really getting people to give their perspectives is good for you as a leader. And then the third is saying to them, if they look outward and people see them doing that, they will actually look really good within the organization. And usually you do get people changing their behavior. It mightn't be a perfect change in behavior because, you know, patterns are hard to break, but usually you will get leaders choosing to say a bit less and to actively listen. And it's like every feedback loop. If I start working on this and I kind of start paying attention to who am I ignoring when they told me something valuable, recording that information and looking backwards, people do change their behavior even if they're not kind of fully into this is the way to lead in the future. So it's really about narrative. And I always say for organizations that feel a bit kind of, you know, toxic and things are tough, start with the meetings and make sure that people are, you know, speaking up in the meetings and that you're getting the person who's running the meeting to say a bit less. The lady in the back.
Thank you. Go around here. Super interesting. I love those 4 crises that you had up, but it does seem that often it's those high ego leaders that do rise to the top. So I suppose 2 questions. 1, why is it the high ego leaders that rise to the top? And secondly, I think especially given the challenges and crises that we are facing as a world right now, we need the best kind of leadership possible. So how can we create the conditions for low ego leaders to rise to the top instead?
So any change in an organization or in society comes from kind of 3 different ways. So you have tone from the top. So basically somebody, the CEO will say, we're going to now have a change where a different type of leader or a different type of traits are going to be valued. The second is where you have a kind of a HR, a compliance-based mechanism that actually comes in, so a rule is kind of enforced. And the third is where leaders themselves start doing things differently and start seeing the rewards. And I think to kind of answer your question, now in organizations I'm being asked, can you come in and tell us how we can identify inclusive leaders in the organization as something that's going to be taken into account when we're being promoted? So again, when I showed that slide about the future of work, that's what kind of gives me signals. Okay, it's slower than I would want to happen, but people are really taking seriously that you don't just need one person who can generate a lot of money for an organization. You need one person who can generate a lot of money. You still need high competency, but they need to create a leader who can generate a lot of money, who can also create a leader. So there's an entire, you know, bunch of people who are actually coming behind them. I think the other way, which is, I guess, is the way that we're kind of describing, is that you use this leadership style as a way to kind of leverage and get ahead. And I always, you know, in most sectors that I've seen, and public service is much harder to kind of, you know, politics is, because politicians play politics, it's much harder to kind of quantify this sort of stuff. But in corporate companies, if you're somebody who is really paying attention to ideas that are around you, you're joining the dots in unusual ways, and you're gaining from innovation, yes, you're acting inclusively, which is something that's good for society, but that's giving you an edge within your company. If you're gaining that edge, you will actually move ahead. And people often say to me, you know, we have teams that have like really high culture scores, but their performance is very lackluster. They take ages to produce things, they're not doing so well. And when you go in and you look at those teams, they're not leading inclusively in the way we're describing tonight. You have someone who's a really nice leader, who has a really great atmosphere in their team, and ultimately they're not that productive. So what you need to get is the 2 things together, this high competency and also inclusive leadership. But the good news is some companies are actually acting now for this in promotions.